During the worldwide pandemic, living in confinement at home, I began to see the artworks in my collection of contemporary art as though they were participants in a Zoom conference to which I'd also been invited. But as this conference dragged on, I began wondering whether, in his 1997 book, After the End of Art, the art critic Arthur Danto had a point when he claimed that art history ended around the time Andy Warhol made Brillo boxes. In the past, Danto wrote, art progressed in a series of historic movements that gave its story meaning. But the story lost its way once a Brillo box could be a work of art. From then on, every visual artist was condemned to go off on his or her own, and their creations were fated to be as random as the fleeting events of a day anyone might jot down in a diary. And that meant the end of art. From the 1980s on, I acquired artworks by young, then fairly unknown artists, some of whom I sensed might have a rendezvous with destiny. But by Danto's reckoning, I started acquiring art after the end of art. None of the contemporary works of art I acquired could really be art. The works I bought could be just another diary of my life, like the capsules I saved from the bottles of wine I consumed, the colorful pencils I bought at souvenir shops, the place cards I saved from dinners to which I was invited, the napkins I collected from restaurants where I dined, the koozies I kept from seaside tiki bars where I had a drink or two, the badges I saved from events I attended, the candles I bought at English cathedrals, the brooms my wife brought me from her travels around the world, and the notes she handwrote me, and the drawings she drew me over the years. Come to think of it, my art collection could really be another diary of my life, because I often decided to buy a work when I noticed details that coincided with what was going on in my life at the time, like this crate I acquired from an art gallery when I was an antitrust lawyer working on a litigation against Budweiser. The safety pins in this work caught my eye because, by happenstance, just 2 days earlier, I'd used safety pins to hem my slacks. The yellow piece of acrylic polymer hanging in this sculpture had reminded me of the texture of the nutriberries favored by our parrot, Verdi. When I was employed as an assistant federal public defender, this collage of newspaper headlines brought to mind the drug traffickers I often represented. But my art collection is more than my diary. It tells the story of a movement in art history whose artists were less preoccupied with creating pricey works of art than with making the most of their moment to flirt with immortality. The cohesion of this movement disproves Arthur Nanto's claim that art history is no longer telling a story. Admittedly, the formats of many works in my collection, whether depicting human figures, or landscapes, or abstractions, do not look much different from the art of earlier decades, or even of past centuries. But by the time I started buying contemporary art, art was mutating out of traditional forms. Most of the works in my collection are products of this mutation in art's genetic code. The way this bird in Bruegel's famous painting of hunters in the snow, in this work in my collection, mutates into its tinfoil silhouette glued on an office file folder. Or the way, in this work, a photograph, instead of being framed, curls, unframed, into a bookshelf. What looks like the moon in this work is in fact a Percocet tablet. The stars are fragments of pills, and its tree line is made of marijuana leaves. This work includes a reproduction of Renoir's famous painting, Young Girls at the Piano, on a needlepoint canvas left mostly unfinished. The manufacturer's color code deconstructs Renoir's palette into a column of color boxes. These two works are color boxes, made only of congealed paint pigments, glued onto canvas. Once the format of artworks started mutating, everyday objects, like these pieces of soccer balls stitched together, offered an appealing new genetic code for art to mutate into, especially for artists who, like environmental activists advocating resistance against man's encroachments on nature, created art in resistance against the art market's commodification of art, the way this sanded-down dollar bill calls attention to the corrosive power of money. The artists who participated in this resistance had different sensibilities. Some of these artists injected new energy into objects that otherwise would have been discarded. This work gathered together cast-off objects into an assemblage that evokes a young universe, breaking out of its frame by exploding in a big bang. This sculpture fastens together disposable coffee cup holders in the shape of a rising plume of steam. This stack of storage cubes holds gravity in balance. Polemical artists used ordinary objects to expose the underbelly of a system that elevated art into a valuable commodity, but treated so much else as dispensable, the way this artist made this piece out of second-hand clothing. Or the way cut-out newspaper headlines in this collage look like gravestones for stories that are no more. This photograph shows what's left of newspapers once history has moved on. while this crate of empty beer cans and used auto parts treats discarded objects ironically, as though they were timeless. Could this work evoke someone behind bars, reduced to receiving crumpled envelopes in the mail and writing smears on a writing pad, feeling that he too is dispensable? Artists with a humorous bent parodied the process of a commodification, the way when Parquet magazine commissioned Mariko Mori to make an edition, she taunted Parquet's star-making machinery by creating this doll of herself as a sexy rock star. Or the way this artist rubbed her mascara and lipstick on a kitchen towel, as though she were branding herself. In this video, the artist caricatures the objectification of women by objectifying herself. The different facets of this movement in art history come together in this sculpture. The ancient-looking jug it displays atop its pedestal exudes physical energy. But because it's a fake antique made by a contemporary artist, it also parodies its era's excessive tendency to treat art as a pricey commodity. Entitled American Anxieties, my latest acquisition was created a few months before the coronavirus pandemic forced people to mutate back into their cocoons. It contains a roll of toilet paper so uncannily pregnant with premonition that this work may foretell the next direction of art history. While earlier works in my collection seemed to disparage domestic spaces, like this photograph of a cluttered room with windows left overexposed, or this collage of pages from interior decorating magazines surrounded by mounds of paper pulp. This piece, with the word Vivat on its glass vitrine, looks more respectful of the kind of private interior spaces to which people were confined during the worst of the pandemic. Once life becomes less confining, there may be more art like this that invites viewers to look inside, mindful that often the only way out is the way in.